What's up, everyone? Hope you all doing well. I got my coffee here, drinking on it. It's a little windy out today, but it's nice out. As always, thanks for joining our breakfast training talk. I think this is episode 20, so very exciting. Yay! My goal is to kind of do 100 of these in all, and I hope that eventually, this page slowly grows because I'm selfish and I want to have more people listen to this talks. So naturally, if you guys like them, share them, comment, subscribe, and notify, and maybe tell a coffee person, a person of coffee maker, coffee, probably not a barista. I'm not a coffee company that I'm down to sell my my initial ad time slot for some coffee plugs, so we can share some coffee ads in this as a cheap, shameless attempt to get free coffee. So we're talking today about strength qualities, and specifically about how there's different kinds of strengths and how they all kind of fit together, and we'll look at it in the most elementary sense, and we'll walk through a couple, and hopefully it helps explain why in programming you see certain types of training and how you can organize them as a whole to help your training as a whole. So one of the first and most obvious ways to think about strength is the maximal amount of strength you can produce. That is max strength. And when we're talking about max strength, no, not myself, but the maximal ability to produce strength, we're talking about essentially your body's ability to just produce force. Now, you can measure this in either an isometric regime where you're doing it and pushing against something, or as more traditional and more common just due to the equipment you have nearby, you're going to do it in a dynamic regime, that is lifting the weight. So isometric, you're pushing against; dynamic, you're lifting. What's really important though, and we need to understand very well, is that when we test in a dynamic regime, like lifting a weight, we need to make sure the right muscles are actually being used. Like if you do a squat, and athlete A squats wide based and athlete A squats narrow, athlete A squats Y and athlete B squats narrow, and athlete A who squats Y works their hips, and athlete B who squats narrow works their quads. That's not the same exercise. It is the same exercise, I should say. It's not the same muscle groups creating motion. If we're using that exercise to basically assess muscle groups, because that's why we're doing this. We're using an exercise to test the strength of a muscle group. Well, then we should make sure the right muscle groups are being used. Makes sense to me. I hope that makes sense to you. So when we look at that and we're doing a squat, because the squat is going to train the knee extensors and hip extensors in similar form that jumping tests explosive knee and hip extension, we should have a movement that fits that well. So maximal strength, the most amount of force you can produce. Now when we look at something like explosive strength, that's basically, and again, it's very similar to rate of force development, the speed at which you can produce force, I should say. Explosive strength is a derivative of maximal strength. It is the speed at which you could produce force, but if you're doing it in a dynamic setting, you're typically assessing it with a lighter weight. More times than not, a rough estimate would be somewhere between maybe 80 to 40% of 1 rep max, kind of depending on where you want to look. And the speed at which they can lift it, the most amount of power they can lift. Again, we're doing this in the sense of a very elementary way to do it in the setting that you work in. In the traditional sense, you would say, well, that's isometric strength, the mid-thigh pull. The speed at which you can produce that isometric strength is rate of force development or explosive strength. And the starting strength, which is the last quality, is the initial ramping of tension that is going from 0 to something. And that is your starting strength. And in a application world, it's very difficult to do that, but I guess an unloaded knee extension or something like that, it's not very common to assess. So you kind of have, in essence, 2 key strength qualities, that is maximal strength and explosive strength, assessed by the most amount of weight you can lift, and then in conjunction, the speed at which you could lift a lighter weight. Now there's another one, by the way, caveat to that, explosive strength is also assessed with a vertical jump. Why? Because it's your body weight explosively being propelled upward in a similar motion that is the squat pattern. And so there are different ways to assess explosive strength, as I've hopefully alluded to a little earlier, because obviously I point out a couple. But explosive strength being assessed through a vertical jump is probably the most common and easiest to do. Now, it's important to control range of motion in certain aspects of testing But we need to make sure that we understand why we're testing a vertical jump. It's not just to say, oh, look, they jump high, but obviously that's important. It might be because it gives us insights into their innate qualities within their muscles, or their ability to produce force, especially relative to their body weight. Maximal strength, if you're talking relative to body weight, is just the strength they can produce, how much weight they can lift relative to their body weight. And lastly, we have another quality which is more dynamic in nature, and that is reactive strength. And that is when you're doing something like a plyometric and you hit the ground, you have a reaction, you have to react to it, and how you produce rapid amount of force quickly, magnitude and speed, after hitting the ground. Hit the ground, you react to it, and that reaction creates stretch reflexes. It creates a stretch shortening cycle, and you have to produce force and jump. And so things like a depth jump would make a lot of sense there. So there we have a couple of qualities. We have max strength, we have explosive strength, and we have, well, reactive strength. And in that, it's important to, well, I also mentioned starting strength, but I mentioned that very quickly, and we're not going to dive into that. So as a coach, you might want to look at areas of weakness. Are they really strong? Are they not strong? Do they jump high? Do they not jump high? Relative to their sporting outcomes, how do they actually perform the sport? What do you think the sport, based on how they perform, they're lacking? Does their assessment match up with that? So that's a really easy way to kind of balance it all. To think about it in terms of a stratification of needs, assessment tools, and then going into actually application. So again, a lot of way you can apply the stuff is basically doing the right movements, max strength, lifting heavy, getting stronger, explosive, jumping, being fast and explosive, and reactive, doing things like plyometrics. So I just want to dive into some of those quickly, share them without much detail. I apologize because you could go into much more detail for each section, but I'll give a basic outline for coaches that are interested. And as always, there's another axis involved. If we had a three-dimensional space, we had maybe the amount of force you could produce, the speed at which it's produced. And if we give a third dimension to this, it would be the repetition, your ability to time. How many times could you produce this? And that'd be your capacity. So if we're talking about strength endurance, power endurance, general endurance, or any kind of repeat stretch shortening cycle endurance, there's always a capacity factor that goes along with it. Something to think about. I appreciate you guys listening. I don't really end these that well. I kind of just stop talking because I get kind of hungry and I want to eat my food. I have a bug that's been flying around my head this whole time that I've been really patiently ignoring. I appreciate y'all listening. I hope you enjoy. I'm going to drink my coffee. As always, take care. Have a good Sunday. And thanks for tuning in.